raw mammaries, sore nipples, and a never-ending chorus of hungry, wailing infants. Welcome to the life of a Victorian wet nurse, where your body isn't your own, your milk belongs to someone else's baby, and your dignity is optional. London, 1862. The fog hung heavy over the city streets, almost as heavy as Lettie Barrow's milk-swollen breasts as she trudged through the early morning mist toward her employer's Belgravia townhouse. Her own infant, barely 6 weeks old, had been left with her mother-in-law in their cramped one-room dwelling in 7 Dials. The child would be fed cow's milk diluted with water and sweetened with sugar, a poor substitute for mother's milk, but what choice did Lettie have? Her husband's meager earnings as a bootblack weren't enough to keep food on the table, let alone a roof over their heads. Better your child starves slowly on cow's milk than quickly on nothing at all, her mother-in-law had said with the cheerful pragmatism of someone who had buried 4 of her 8 children before their first birthdays. The grand home of the Cranfield family loomed ahead, its pristine white facade a stark contrast to the soot-stained tenements Lettie called home. Inside that house, little Master Edward Cranfield, heir to a textile fortune, awaited his morning feeding. Unlike Lettie's own child, Master Edward would never know hunger, cold, or want, and ironically, he would achieve this privilege by literally taking the food from another baby's mouth. The parlor maid greeted Lettie with the usual mixture of disdain and pity as she showed her to the nursery. Wet nurses occupied a curious position in the Victorian household hierarchy, essential yet embarrassing, somewhere between the cook and the chamber pot emptier. After all, the wet nurse's job was to expose her breast to a gentleman's child several times daily, a necessary obscenity in polite society. "You're 3 minutes late," sniffed Mrs. Higgins, the nursery maid, as Lettie entered. The master has been most distressed. By the master, she meant the 6-month-old Edward, who was indeed red-faced and howling in his ornate crib. His actual father, Vincent Cranfield, would never acknowledge the existence of bodily functions so base as hunger or digestion, especially not as they pertain to infants. "Forgive me," Lettie murmured, already unbuttoning her bodice with practiced efficiency. The omnibus was delayed. "Excuses won't fill the young master's stomach, will they?" Mrs. Higgins said with a sniff, handing over the screaming bundle of silk and lace. Lettie settled into the designated nursing chair and positioned the child at her breast. The immediate silence as he latched on was almost worth the aching in her feet from the 3-mile walk when she couldn't afford the omnibus fare. Almost. What made the life of a Victorian wet nurse particularly miserable wasn't just the physical discomfort or the emotional toll of being separated from one's own child, though those were considerable. It was the absurd web of rules, restrictions, and requirements that employers imposed on the women they hired to nourish their precious offspring. For instance, there was the matter of diet. Mrs. Cranfield, who had read all the latest childcare manuals, had strict notions about what Lettie could consume. No cabbage, onions, or strong flavors, the lady of the house had instructed during their first meeting. No beer or spirits, of course. Nothing spiced or seasoned. Plain boiled meat, bread, milk puddings, simple, wholesome foods only. Never mind that Lettie's own diet at home consisted mainly of whatever she could afford, often just bread and weak tea. When nursing at the Cranfields, she was fed bland, institutional meals that would make prison gruel seem positively exotic. The irony wasn't lost on her that she ate better as a servant than she did in her own home, even if the food was reminiscent of wet cardboard. Then there were the moral requirements. Wet nurses were expected to be of impeccable character, no drinking, no sexual relations, even with their own husbands, and absolutely no strong emotions that might sour the milk. Medical men of the era genuinely believed that a woman's milk could be tainted by her feelings, potentially transferring vice or hysteria to the infant. "Remember," Mrs. Cranfield reminded her weakly, "your temperament affects the child. Dr. Hamilton says that a passionate or melancholy nurse can cause infantile colic or, worse, develop in the child a tendency toward moral weakness." How convenient, Lettie often thought, that her employer had a medical justification for demanding she remain unnaturally calm while working 14-hour days, her breasts perpetually sore, her own baby miles away being inadequately fed by someone else. Heaven forbid she experienced natural human emotions like worry, anger, or grief. The milk must remain sweet, even if the woman producing it was slowly curdling inside. Wealthy Victorians had elaborate theories about wet nurses and their milk. Some believed that physical characteristics could be transmitted through breast milk. A red-haired nurse might produce a red-haired child, regardless of the parent's coloring. Others feared that moral failings were similarly communicable. The idea that a working-class woman might somehow corrupt a noble infant through her milk was a constant anxiety among the upper classes. Dr. Vincent Cranfield, a physician with a Harley Street practice and no relation to Lettie's employers, had written a popular treatise on the selection of appropriate wet nurses. The ideal candidate, he wrote, should be between 25 and 30 years of age, of robust constitution, with clear eyes, sound teeth, and a calm, cheerful disposition. Her own child should be healthy and preferably of the same sex as her charge, born within 2 months of the infant she is to nurse. What Dr. Cranfield failed to mention was that these women were usually nursing someone else's baby because their own had died, creating a convenient supply of milk without the inconvenient attachment of a living child, or because dire poverty forced them to abandon their infants to the dubious care of others while they earned money as a human cow. Lettie had seen the advertisements in the Times. Wanted, healthy young woman as wet nurse, must be of good character, clean in her habits, and have a plentiful supply of milk. Child not objected to if suitably boarded out. Child not objected to, as if her baby were an inconvenient pet that could be kennelled while she worked. The reality of boarding out was frequently grim. Baby farms, where infants were left in the care of women who took in multiple children for payment, were notorious for their high mortality rates. The caretakers, often desperate themselves, would dilute milk to feed more babies with less, or dose them with opiates to keep them quiet. Some baby farmers, like the infamous Amelia Dyer, went further, murdering their charges outright and continuing to collect fees from parents who believed their children were being cared for. Lettie was fortunate, if one could call it that her mother-in-law was available to mind her son. At least she knew the woman wouldn't deliberately harm the child, even if her outdated childcare practices left much to be desired. "Have you checked the young master's napkin?" Mrs. Higgins interrupted Lettie's thoughts. "Yes, he's dry," Lettie replied automatically. 6 months into this position, she knew better than to neglect any aspect of Master Edward's comfort. "And you're certain your milk is agreeing with him? He seemed colicky yesterday." Lettie bit her tongue. Young Master Edward had been perfectly content until his mother had fed him a spoonful of honey to strengthen his constitution, a practice that would have horrified modern pediatricians but was considered healthful in Victorian times. "He seems settled today," she said diplomatically. The wet nurse's position was particularly precarious because she could be dismissed at any moment if the family decided her milk wasn't suitable or if she broke any of their arbitrary rules. With no employment protections and desperate need, women like Lettie endured extraordinary indignities to keep their positions. Take the matter of clothing. Mrs. Cranfield insisted that Lettie wear a special nursing uniform provided by the household, ostensibly for cleanliness, but clearly designed to mark her as a servant. The stiff, high-collared dress with its row of functional buttons down the front made her feel like a human feeding apparatus rather than a woman. It was also abominably hot, causing her to perspire constantly, which then led to Mrs. Higgins commenting on her questionable hygiene. "Perhaps we should discuss your bathing routine," the nursery maid suggested one particularly warm afternoon. Mrs. Cranfield wonders if twice weekly is sufficient. This from a woman whose employer, like most upper-class Victorians, considered a full bath a monthly event at most. Meanwhile, Lettie was expected to somehow maintain the cleanliness of a hospital ward while living in a slum with no running water, where she paid a penny for a communal bath in a public washhouse when she could afford it. The wet nurse's body was subject to regular inspection, too, a humiliation Lettie endured monthly when Dr. Longworth visited to check her general health and the quality of her milk. "Excellent consistency," he would pronounce after expressing a few drops onto his fingertips, as if she were a prize dairy cow. "Good color. Continue with the oatmeal porridge in the mornings. It promotes lactation." On this particular morning, as young Master Edward suckled contentedly, Lettie gazed out the nursery window at the garden below. Mrs. Cranfield was strolling with her friend Mrs. Pemberton, both women elegant in their morning dresses, parasols tilted against the mild spring sunshine. Their conversation drifted up through the partially open window. "I cannot understand these modern women who insist on nursing their own infants," Mrs. Pemberton was saying. "So unnecessarily taxing on one's constitution, and it ruins the figure." "Indeed," agreed Mrs. Cranfield. "And there's something almost animal about it, don't you think? Much better to employ someone suited to the task." Someone suited to the task. That was Lettie, not quite human in their eyes, but a convenient biological function personified. Upper-class Victorian women were considered too delicate, too refined for the base physical act of nursing. Their sensibilities were too exquisite, their nervous systems too finely calibrated to withstand the demands of lactation. So they outsourced this most primal of connections to women whose bodies were apparently designed for utility rather than beauty or comfort. The greatest irony of all was that these same society ladies who couldn't bear to nurse their own children would proudly declare themselves the moral guardians of home and hearth, champions of sacred motherhood, while paying another mother to neglect her own child in service to theirs. When Master Edward finished feeding, Lettie carefully burped him and placed him in his crib for his morning nap. Her breasts, temporarily relieved of their burden, still ached. She would need to express milk before returning to feed her own son, or risk painful engorgement and possibly mastitis, an inflammation that could end her employment if it reduced her milk supply. As if reading her thoughts, Mrs. Higgins appeared with a glass bottle. "You'll need to express enough for the young master's evening feed," she said. "The family has a dinner engagement, and they prefer you not to be seen by the guests." Lettie nodded resignedly. Another joy of being a Victorian wet nurse. You were either too embarrassing to be seen or treated as a curiosity to be displayed, depending on the employer's whims. Some families proudly introduced their wet nurse to visitors as a symbol of their wealth and concern for their child's welfare. Others, like the Cranfields, preferred to maintain the illusion that their infant mysteriously thrived without anything so vulgar as actual sustenance. By late afternoon, Lettie's workday was finally complete. She collected her day's wages, 3 shillings, a princely sum compared to the pennies she might earn at a factory, but barely adequate compensation for what she provided, and began the long walk home. She couldn't afford the omnibus fare if she wanted to bring something for supper. Her breasts were beginning to fill again as she approached her neighborhood. The familiar sounds and smells of 7 Dials enveloped her. Unwashed bodies, rotting vegetables, sewage, and the constant babble of too many people living in too little space. After the sterile quiet of the Cranfield nursery, the cacophony was almost comforting. Her mother-in-law met her at the door, baby wailing in her arms. "About time," the older woman grumbled. "He's been crying for an hour. Got no more sugar to sweeten his milk." Lettie took her son, noting with a pang how much lighter he felt than the plump Master Edward. His cheeks had none of the healthy roundness of the Cranfield baby. His cry was weaker, his skin paler. She settled on their single chair and offered her breast, praying she had enough milk left after feeding her employer's child all day. The bitter truth of wet nursing in Victorian London was this: the women hired to nourish the children of the wealthy often watched their own children waste away or die from inadequate nutrition. The rich baby thrived at the direct expense of the poor baby. It was biological class warfare, the most literal example of the privileged feeding off the disadvantaged. As Lettie's son nursed weakly at her depleted breast, she pondered the cruel mathematics of her situation. Her milk, sold by the feeding, earned enough to keep a roof over their heads and food on their plates. But at what cost to her child? Yet without this income, they might all find themselves in the workhouse, where families were separated and conditions were even more dire. "The young master has started on rice pudding," Mrs. Higgins had mentioned that morning. "Mrs. Cranfield thinks he may be weaned by summer's end." Summer's end. 3 more months of this impossible balancing act, assuming the Cranfields didn't decide to wean their son earlier on a whim. 3 months of dividing herself, her body, her milk, her maternal attention, between 2 infants with wildly different prospects. There now, Lettie whispered to her son as he finally drifted to sleep, milk drunk but likely not fully satisfied. Soon this will be over, and I'll be just yours again. Unless, of course, she became pregnant again out of economic necessity. Many wet nurses found themselves in an endless cycle, producing babies to produce milk to earn wages to feed the babies they neglected to produce milk. It was a particular form of reproductive servitude unique to their profession. As the gas lamps flickered to life outside her window, Lettie laid her sleeping son in the drawer that served as his bed. She could hear her husband's heavy tread on the stairs. Victor was home from his day of shining shoes outside the railway station. "How's my boy?" he asked, placing a few coins on their wobbly table. "Growing," Lettie lied. "And yours? How was your day?" Victor shrugged, dropping onto their shared mattress with exhaustion. "Same as always, bent backs and black polish." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, too tired for conversation but taking comfort in each other's presence. "Mrs. Cranfield was wearing new shoes today," Lettie said finally. "Satin with pearl buttons. Must have cost more than you earn in a month. And her husband probably spent twice that on cigars," Victor added without bitterness. Just the resigned observation of someone who had never expected life to be fair. Lettie laughed softly. "The true miracle of the upper classes isn't that they have so much. It's that they need so many of us to keep them going. Wet nurses, nannies, cooks, maids, bootblacks. They can't even feed their own babies without our help. Maybe that's why they call them the dependent classes," Victor suggested with a rare smile. Lettie thought about Master Edward, who would grow up to inherit his father's business and property, who would likely never know her name or remember the woman whose body had nourished him through his vulnerable early months. She thought about her own son, fighting to thrive on leftovers and love. The bitter irony of the Victorian wet nurse's existence was perfectly captured in the medical wisdom of the era. Physicians genuinely believed that a nursing woman's emotions could affect her milk. They were right, of course, but not in the way they imagined. It wasn't that Lettie's frustration or sorrow would somehow poison Master Edward. It was that the system forcing her to prioritize his nourishment over her own child's was itself toxic. In the candlelight, Lettie examined her raw, cracked nipples and the blue veins mapping her swollen breasts. Tomorrow she would do it all again. Wake before dawn, leave her hungry child, and walk to Belgravia to feed a baby who would never know want. "You know what they say," she murmured to Victor as they prepared for sleep. "The rich man's baby drinks the milk, while the poor man's baby gets the watered-down dregs. But don't worry, in 50 years, they'll put this whole wet nurse business in a museum and call it progress. Meanwhile, I'll just be here, leaking from both ends. Milk from my breasts and tears from my eyes, wondering which will run dry first."